On this episode, we examine a story of evangelism where a couple took loving thy neighbor a little bit too seriously. I'm Carson Crow, and this is Believe in the Possibilities. Welcome to Believe in the Possibilities, sharing real stories of evangelism to build your confidence, strengthen your conviction, and inspire you to act this week. I'm Carson Crow, one of the ministers at Charlestown Road, and I'm excited that you're joining me for another episode of Believe in the Possibilities. This podcast is built around one simple idea. Sometimes the reason that we aren't evangelistic isn't because we don't care about people. It isn't because we don't know enough. Sometimes just deep down, we simply don't believe anything will actually happen. We assume they'll say no. We assume they aren't interested. We assume we've already invited them enough times. And when we stop believing there are possibilities, we usually stop trying. Today's story is a reminder that sometimes the distance between someone never hearing the gospel and an entire family obeying the gospel is simply this: somebody refused to give up too early. I recently heard a story of a family that I know and I hold dear, who grew up with an interest in religion, but without much consistency. They wanted to know God, but really didn't know where to look for truth. Throughout the children's younger years, the family moved between several denomination churches, Episcopalian, the Methodist, and back to Episcopalian. They were religious in every sense of the word. They were interested, but they never really settled down anywhere. And then while one of the children was in elementary school, their family met another family through a child in the same class. Their name was the Jones family. And over the years, the two families became incredibly close. They carpooled together, they ate meals together, they went on vacations together, they watched their children grow up together. For years, they simply did life alongside one another. But the Jones family did something else during those years. They talked about the Lord, not obnoxiously, not aggressively, not as though every conversation had to become a debate. They simply weren't afraid to bring up God in ordinary conversations. And when difficult spiritual questions came up, they were willing to talk about them. They approached those conversations with patience, with kindness, with gentleness, and they invited this other family to worship. Not once, not twice, but again and again and again. And for years, the answer apparently wasn't the one they were hoping for. But they still kept loving them. They kept being their friends. They kept talking about the Lord, and they kept on inviting. And then after approximately about 6 years of friendship, this family finally accepted one of those invitations. 6 years. Think about that. They walked into worship with the Jones family and began to see something different. They realized that this family wasn't just religious. They were worshiping with people who sincerely were trying to follow the Lord according to His word. And so that eventually that invitation led to more conversations, and the conversations became Bible studies. They began studying with the Jones family more deliberately and more in a focused manner, and with the local preacher. And then just a few months later, the entire family obeyed the gospel. 6 years. Think about that for just a second. I kept coming back to that number as that person shared that story with me. 6 years. Imagine if the Joneses had stopped after 6 months. Imagine if they said, we invited them 3 times. They obviously aren't interested. Imagine if they had stopped mentioning spiritual things because they were afraid of making the relationship awkward. Imagine if somewhere around year 3 they had decided if they wanted to come, they would have just come by now. They would have had plenty of reasons to give up. But they didn't. And years later, an entire family could look backward and say, thank God they kept asking. That challenges me. I don't know about you all, because I can't help but wonder how many people around us were actually closer than we realized, but somebody gave up too early. How many neighbors received one invitation, but never received the 10th? How many coworkers had one spiritual conversation, but nobody ever followed it up? How many friends initially said no, not because they would always say no, but because they simply weren't ready yet? There is an enormous difference between no and not yet. and sometimes we have absolutely no idea which one we are hearing. I think about Acts chapter 14, 1 through 3. In Acts chapter 1 or 14, 1 through 3, you see a story of Paul and evangelism. Paul and Barnabas enter Iconium. They begin preaching. Some believe, others don't. Opposition grows against them. And then notice what Luke says in verse 3. Therefore, they spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord. I love that phrase. They spent a long time there. There was opposition. There were people who didn't believe. There were people actively working against them. But Paul and Barnabas didn't immediately conclude, well, I guess nobody here is interested. They stayed, they spoke, and they continued to trust in God to see what the results would be. Evangelism sometimes requires exactly that kind of persistence. Not obnoxious persistence, but the kind of the Joneses. Gentle, reverent, patient persistence. The kind that says, I love you enough to bring it up again. I care about you enough to invite you again. I haven't stopped praying for you. And if the door opens again, I will walk through it. So here's the challenge I want to leave you with this week. Who have you given up on too early? Maybe there's someone you've invited months ago. Invite them again. Maybe you tried to start a spiritual conversation and it went nowhere. Look for another opportunity, or maybe strike up that conversation again with the same person. Maybe someone once told you they weren't interested in a Bible study. Don't pressure them, but stop. Love them enough to pray for them and to seek them again and ask them one more time and look for another door. People change. Circumstances change. Hearts change. A person who wasn't interested initially 5 years ago may be searching desperately today. The Jones family could not make their friends obey the gospel, but they could keep loving them. They could keep living faithfully in front of them. They could keep talking about Jesus. They could extend the invitation over and over again. And that's what they did. And eventually the door opened. That's an amazing story of evangelism. And that is evangelism. We plant, we water, and we wait. And God gives the increase. Our job isn't to determine ahead of time who will respond or what plants will grow. Our job is to faithfully give people the opportunity. And so this week, be the Jones family. Be patient, be gentle, be courageous, be persistent, and don't confuse someone's not yet with never. Thanks for listening.